Hello and welcome to the Memory Caps podcast. This is just a quick PSA before our episode starts. There were two interviews I did before NAIC this year with Stefan Erickson and with Mike Fouchet. Unfortunately, because of NAIC being such a long weekend and then me immediately going on a 3-week trip to Europe right afterwards, I was not able to get the editing done for these episodes in time. I am now back from Europe, finishing them up. So if anything is mentioned in these episodes talking about the upcoming meta for NAIC, I apologize. It might not be very relevant anymore, but the vast majority of these episodes is just great conversations with great players about their histories and how much they love the game. So I hope you enjoy, and moving forward, expect some great interviews going into this next season. Have a good one. Hello and welcome to the Memory Capsule podcast, where we interview members of the Pokemon TCG community. My name is Rafal Gladys. Each week we'll be speaking with our guests about their background with Pokemon TCG, how they got involved with the game, and giving them an opportunity to share their love of the game. Today's guest is Mike Fouchet. Mike has 2 decades of experience in the Pokemon TCG, having seen consistent success over the years on a variety of decks. Some of his biggest finishes include second place at Philadelphia Regionals, top 4 at US Nationals in 2008, multiple top 32 Worlds finishes, as well as countless other top regional top cuts and top finishes. He's also one of the hosts of the Trashalanche podcast, which he's been doing for over 3 years. How you doing, Mike?
Doing really good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. Is there anything I missed with our introduction or anything you'd like our listeners to know about you that I might have mentioned?
There's so many like little things over the years, but I think you got like the broad picture right. I will say the Trashalanche is approaching its 3rd year, so not quite 3 years, but we're almost there.
Oh, okay. Well, hopefully the anniversary will be good.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess just to get us started, I'll ask the same question I ask all of our guests, which is, what is your favorite card of all time?
I saw this question in the show notes that you sent me, and it's such a tough question when you've been playing for as long as I have. Um, I feel like typically players tend to gravitate towards a card that they have had particular success with. So the one for me that kind of stands out is Electrode EX from, I think it was Fire Red Leaf Green back in like 2005. I played Electrode EX both at Worlds 2005 and 2006. In 2005, it was the Zapdos EX, Rayquaza EX, Electrode EX deck, ZRE. And I was still in the 11 to 14, or now it's called Senior Division, and I went undefeated in Swiss, and then unfortunately lost in the first round of Top Cut, and then yeah. And back then we had bigger top cuts. It wasn't cut to top 8; it was cut to top 32. So that kind of stings even more. And then I played the Dark Tyranitar Electrode deck in 2006, and that was my first year as a master, and I also got top 32 that year with that deck. So back-to-back top 32s in Worlds with Electrode EX, and Electrode EX was just such a fun card. It's very similar to the Electrode that came out a few years ago. It's very similar to the Fortress EX that just came out in Paldea Evolved, where you knocked itself out, and then you got to take a bunch of energy and attach them to your guys. So it's funny that Paldea just came out when I'm talking about this card, because there's so many parallels to the game back then with Iono that just came out, and Rocket's admin that was out then, and the reversal energy that's out now is basically the same thing as scramble energy. And so I've always loved the come from behind mechanics, and that's why I really enjoyed Electrode EX. And the fact that these cards are somewhat reprinted in the modern day is super, super exciting for me.
Definitely, I think a lot of players from like back around that time have had a lot of a lot of excitement. We've seen that with like James Arnold as well. Just very excited to see a lot of these cards coming back. Have you been looking at all into like decks with Fortress? I know it's a significant nerf compared to Electrode, which could essentially it could get scramble energy back, right? So you would like go down on
Yeah.
prizes and then put triple rainbows on everything, which is not quite as good as a bunch of grass, right?
Yeah, I haven't really messed around with Fortress yet. Um, I hadn't even really touched this format until midway through this last week. So to give the listeners some context, we're recording the Monday before NAIC, and a week ago I wasn't going to NAIC because I didn't get in until the very, very last wave when they opened up some spots. So I was kind of ignoring the Paldea format. Um, and now I don't think there's enough time for me to test Fortress stuff before NAIC, but maybe if I end up getting my Worlds invite, I will explore some things for Worlds.
For sure. Yeah, that would be very exciting. Um, so you mentioned that 2005 Worlds you were playing in seniors. So for those who don't know, 2005 Worlds is the second Worlds of all time, and you were already playing
Mhm.
at like a competitive level at that point. Could you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about how you got into the game and how you started playing it competitively?
Yeah. So I actually learned how to play the game through the Game Boy game that came out. The Pokemon TCG Game Boy game.
Hmm.
Um, so I learned how to play through that. I had gotten cards. Base set came out in the States when I was in second grade. So I remember getting some cards for, a gift at some point because I had liked the video game, the Red and Blue games. But when you're a kid, you just kind of like collect and whatnot. But then I got the TCG Game Boy game. I learned how to play. I have two younger brothers. I kind of was like teaching them a little bit how to play, and I looked up a Pokemon League that was 30 minutes from my house. My mom and my dad were pretty supportive, so they would take me there occasionally. And for a number of years, I was not good. I didn't know anything about how to play the game at a competitive level. I just, played a little bit here and there casually. Um, and then there was some tournaments when Wizards of the Coast was still running that I went to, but again, I wasn't doing anything competitive. I just wanted to show up and, experience what a tournament was like. And then when Wizards of the Coast lost the game and Nintendo took it over, they had this tournament in the summer of 2003, I believe, called the Ruby Sapphire Challenge. And the Ruby Sapphire Challenge was a really unique event where you played 3 rounds of VGC, so 3 rounds of the video game, and you played 3 rounds of TCG. And the TCG component was like a more of a draft component. So you got a number of packs and you had to build a deck out of that. Um, and so that was a really cool experience. I wasn't very good at the video game. I was just okay at the card game, but it was so fun. And I met one of my still really, really long time friends at that tournament, Sam Chen. Um, and we became friendly. We started talking online. And then when Nintendo kind of solidified the structure of what their circuit was going to be going forward. So about 6 months later, they started like their first real TCG events. I was able to, with the support of my family and talking to people online through the message boards of like Pokegym and whatnot, I was able to like build a reasonable competitive deck. And I went to a city championship, which is kind of like the league cups of today. And I got second at that, which was cool. And then a couple months later, there was a state championship which they don't have anymore, unfortunately. And I won that. And that was kind of like the big turning point because I won that. And the prize for that was you got $300 to go to the national championship, which was, going to happen in good old Columbus, Ohio in
Oh,
the summer.
really? Even back then?
Yep, even 2004.
Mm.
So like I won this state championship and my mom and my dad were like, "Oh, you won $300. We could actually like go to this event now." I mean, that's not like a ton of money to go, but it's enough that like when your kid wins that, it gave them, a good excuse, I think, to take us on like a little mini vacation and whatnot. And then a couple months after that, there was another tournament called a gym challenge, which honestly, they're the size also of like league cups these days. But gym challenge, have you heard of a gym challenge before? Do you know what?
Well, when I was researching kind of your history as a player, I saw gym challenges, and I was like, I don't quite know what these are. But I did see that you had done well at a bunch, but I didn't really know what they were.
All right, so gym challenges are looking back on it, they're a pretty funny tournament. So again, they're like the size of League Cups, maybe a little bit bigger. Um, but the winner of a gym challenge got an invite and a free trip paid to the World Championships. And
Oh,
second place got like a half a box.
interesting.
So extremely top heavy. And so the first gym challenge that I went to, I won. And so I got a free trip to the World Championships, which was in Florida that year. And that was really the point where my parents were like, oh, damn, we're going to Florida for free? Um, okay, we could do this.
So it
And
wasn't even just an invite; it was also just the trip.
yeah, and since I was a kid, they paid for, for a guardian as well.
Hmm.
Um, And so that was like a really that was kind of like the biggest moment where for me, I was like, oh, I'm good enough that I can play. And my parents were like, okay, we can continue to support him because not only is this just a fun hobby, but it's something that is at minimum self-sustaining, right? It's not going to burn a huge hole in their pocket. Um, so, and then it kind of just kicked off from there. The following year, my brothers were playing too. In 2005, two out of three of us got World's Invites and free travel awards. So, uh, four out of five of my family got a free trip to the World Championships. And um, then since then, it's kind of been like sometimes I play, sometimes I don't. I've gone many years without playing, and then a bunch of years playing, and it's just kind of been a fun ride ever since.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All that all that backstory. I really appreciate it. That was great to hear. Um, do you have well, actually, let me. Sorry, different question actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, So you mentioned that you were kind of finding decks on things like Pokegym and stuff. Like I have some friends who played a little bit around that time, and one of the big things they've told me is that, if you didn't really have the connections or the way to communicate with other good players, there was not an easy way to just find good decks and find meta decks and how to
Yeah.
build them and how to play against them. How were you able to kind of build those connections and build that community that allowed you to be a successful player that was playing, meta decks and not just like some kid who was like putting together his collection without a
Yeah,
resource like Limitless or YouTube or things like that.
yeah, it's a good question. I don't remember exactly how I got into this group, but I would say around that time where in that 2004 season when I, won the state championships or the gym challenge, somewhere around there, I started making connections with some of the top players at the time. One of them, some of them still play today, like Pablo. I started talking to back all the way then. Premawat, I talked to a bit all the way back then. Um, yeah, so I don't remember exactly how I got into the group, but it started with interactions on the PokeGym message boards. And then eventually there was another message board that was more exclusive at the time. It was called Neo. And Neo basically had all of the top players at the time. And honestly, we didn't even talk that much about decks on that message board, but we were just like really friendly with each other. And then you would go to AOL Instant Messenger and IRC at the time, which was, I guess, Discord is kind of like the modern day equivalent of IRC. Um, and you would just, be in chats and talking to people, and we would play games on Apprentice, which was the only way to play Pokemon online back then. An Apprentice, I don't know if you're familiar with Apprentice, but it was like imagine like Limitless tabletop, but designed for Magic and no pictures at all, just like, all text
Oh,
based.
it's all text.
Yeah, all text based, but you'd still like drag and drop, kind of like how you do for
Gotcha.
Limitless. It
When I
was a
started playing, we had played TCG, which is also terrible, but at least you had
yeah,
pictures of the cards.
yeah, yes. It's very similar to play TCG, but no pictures, right?
Gotcha.
Exactly. Um, so yeah, I don't know exactly. I was always a little bit younger than all of those players at the time. Like Pablo, I think is like 2 years older than me. Pramwat's 2 years older than me. So I was always kind of like the young in the group. It's funny to say that now that I'm old and still playing the game. Um, but yeah, it was really just I think at the time, it's really just showing that you had a decent mind for the game and you wanted to get better. And as long as and I think that's similar to now as well. Like if you show people that you want to learn and you want to get better, and you have at least some aptitude for the game, and you're not cocky, you're not like uh, you don't have a bad attitude, like people are willing to help you. And I think that was true back in the day as well. It just now there's more information, so you don't have to have those connections as much,
Hmm.
but back then you really did.
Gotcha. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Now I do have just like kind of a list of some of your finishes, which we can start to dive into more individually. But maybe before we
Sure.
do that, I want to ask you: is there a particular season that stands out to you that maybe you want to tell us a little bit about or focus on, or a particular finish or a particular deck? Before I just kind of start shouting out random finishes and asking
Mhm.
you how that tournament went.
Um, I don't know if there's like a whole season that stands out. The way that the game is has been played over the last 6 or 7 years is such a different experience than it was for the first 12 years that I was involved in the game, because the season starts now in August or September and goes all the way until the next June for NAIC. And back then when I started, there was no events between Worlds and like December or January.
Hmm.
So like the whole fall and first half of winter was just like the quote unquote off season of Pokemon. And then you would have like one or two city championships you would go to in the winter. You'd go to one or two state championships in like March. You'd go to one, maybe two, but often just one regional championship in the spring. And then you'd go to nationals. So like the definition of a season is a much different thing than it was back then. Um, and so because of that, I don't really have a particular season. I would say like the most notable finish and the most memorable experience that I had is for sure getting top four at the 2008 national championship. And that was overall like a good season for me as well. I top eighted the regional that I played too. I don't remember how I did at states, but yeah, I like top eighted a regional and then top four nationals, which was cool.
Okay, so well, in that case, let's maybe get a little bit more into that top four nationals finish. It was with Gardevoir Gallade in 2008, which
Mhm.
was a very, very good deck at the time. And you also got top 16 at nationals with Gardevoir Gallade 2 years later. So maybe we can
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how that deck has changed over time in a minute. But let's talk about 2008. Could you tell us a bit about Gardevoir Gallade? What is that deck, and why was it so good?
Yeah, Gardevoir Secret Wonders is, in the argument for one of the best cards ever printed. Its ability was called Telepass. You got to, once during your turn, you got to use the effect of a supporter card in your opponent's discard pile. So a lot of supporter cards that were played back in the day, most of them were helpful for setup, but sometimes there was some disruption supporters, similar to like Judge. Um, so that ability was insane, and then its attack was also insane. For a psychic and two colorless, it did 60, and your opponent could not use Poke Powers, which basically are abilities, the following turn. So you had an amazingly strong ability, coupled with a very like a solid attack that was also very disruptive. And the Glade was kind of like the secondary. It was just kind of like a big hitter that you would use at certain points. But Gardevoir was really the main star of the show. And you had access to Scramble Energy, which we discussed is basically the same as modern Reversal Energy. So if you're down on prizes, you just slap that on the Gardevoir and attack with it. And then there was also Double Rainbow Energy, which counted for two of any energy, and then your attacks did 10 less damage. So if you were behind on prizes, you'd use Scramble, and then when you went up on prizes, you could just attach the double rainbow in addition to the Scramble, and now you could still keep using Psychic Lock, Gardevoir's attack. Um, so Gardevoir, pretty much that whole season of 2008 was by far the best deck in the format. Nothing really came close until like at Nationals and Worlds, Empoleon was like a close second, but Gardevoir is still pretty dominant. And we saw that in at the U.S. Nationals. I top four. Three out of the top four were Gardevoir. I lost to Drew Holton in top four, who is one of like an old school player that's extremely good. He top eight at Worlds. He came second obviously at the U.S. Nationals. Very very good player. And then Gino won U.S. Nationals, and then Jason ended up winning Worlds that year, also beating Gino in top four. So Gardevoir clearly very dominant. The one thing that I had a little bit spicy in my Gardevoir was I played 2 Cessation Crystal in the deck. And Cessation Crystal was a tool that if it was attached to your active Pokemon, it shut off your opponent's abilities, Pokepowers, Pokebodies. And so the idea of that was that you would use Gardevoir, use the Psychic Lock to make sure that they were not using their abilities. And then when you wanted to attack with the Gallade to take a big knockout, you would be breaking that lock. But if you attach a Cessation Crystal, then you would still be continuing the lock while also, taking the big knockout. And so that was an idea of one of my friends from Argentina, Agustin, who is pretty good friends with Diego Casiraga, who still plays. And so Diego, Agustin, and I kind of came up with this Cessation Crystal Guardy. They did really well at the Argentinian Nationals that year with it. And then, I obviously did very well at U.S. Nationals, which is really cool. So yeah. So one of the reasons that tournament means so much to me is not only did I top 4, but in top, I forget exactly which rounds, but as I said before, at big tournaments like that, we didn't just cut to top 8. We had a much larger top cut. I forget if that year was top 32 or top 64, but the first 2 rounds of top cut, I had to play Jason Klaczynski and I had to play Puka.
Oh, wow.
In back-to-back rounds. I think it was top 32 and top 16. I had to play Puka and then Jason back-to-back, and I beat both of them. And so that's part of why that tournament means so much to me, is because it really felt like, not only was it like my first really big finish, but it also felt like I really deserved it because I had to go through them. Because even back then, they were, 2 of the best players ever. And Jason is someone in particular that now I'm very good friends with Jason, but at the time, he was still very much like my idol in the game. When I started, he had so many results before Wizards of the Coast gave the game over, and so like I grew up kind of like reading his articles and what he wrote and seeing his results, and then like being able to beat him. That was just a very cool experience.
Yeah, no, that's pretty amazing. Like beating the guy who's like, his content is like part of what helped you become a good player, and especially in the year that he ended up winning Worlds with with Guardy Gallade too, right?
Yeah.
How did that World Championship end up going for you that year?
Yeah, that's that. This is one of my
Sorry if it's a
big.
touchy subject.
That's one of my bigger regrets in the game. So, I probably should have just played Gardevoir again at Worlds, but my friends and I were really trying to get spicy, and so I ended up playing like a Leafeon level X Magmortar deck, and it did not go. It did not go well. But that's okay. So that World's not my best.
Gotcha. Is that in any way kind of like a piece of advice or a lesson you'd give to any players in terms of kind of choosing the decks they play, like stick with the stuff that you're good at, consistent at, as opposed to, maybe when is it like an appropriate time to try to counter the meta as opposed to just being good at playing the meta?
Yeah, it's tough because like the World Championships in particular is a tournament where I feel like taking big swings is more reasonable because everybody there is really good. And so like just playing the best deck well is not like maybe it's enough for sure, but it's like the tournament where it's least likely for it to be enough, if that makes sense.
Just because the
Um,
skill is so similar between all the players.
yeah, exactly. So I don't really have a whenever I've played like a weird deck at Worlds, I don't really have regrets for it because I'm trying to give myself an edge where it's really hard to get an edge. But I will say outside of the World Championships, play the deck that you know the best. Uh, just play a good deck. Um, there's not really too much value in trying to go super anti-meta in especially in today's like larger regionals. Um, because you just got to play your deck well, and as long as your deck is consistent and a strong enough power level, like you're gonna have a much better time than obsessing over countering all of the other decks. Like the good decks are good for a reason, right?
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Now, I did see that in 2010 U.S. Nationals, you also got top 16 with Guardy Gallade,
Hmm.
which to me is a little bit interesting because I feel like we typically don't see that, two full seasons go by and the same
Yeah,
archetype is still good. I guess I'm trying to think of maybe like a modern example of like Pikarom where like
yeah,
things just kept getting rotated, it kept losing cards, but like the core of the deck, which was Pikarom, was so good that it just kept having legs. Is that kind of the situation Guardy Gallade was in where 2 years went by, but as long as the Gardevoir and Gallade are good, you can still make that deck work?
yeah, a bit, yes. So the interesting thing, I talked about the energy cards of the 2008 Guardian Glade, the Scramble and the Double Rainbow. So after 2008 Worlds, those rotated. And then there really wasn't a good way to power up Gardevoir during the 2009 season. There was like some fringe ways to do it, but the deck was not tier one for that whole season because of the lack of energy acceleration. But then in 2010, Hard Gold, Soul Silver came out and Double Colorless Energy came out. And then all of a sudden, you could Psychic Lock for a Psychic and a Double Colorless. And that kind of catapulted Gardevoir back into the conversation. Um, and like you said, the cards themselves are so powerful that as long as you can use them effectively, yeah, they're going to be really good. Um, so that season is also kind of interesting. That was my first year of college, so I didn't play a ton that year, the 2009 2010 season. I played a lot of like gimmicky decks during the state championship and regional season just because, you know, I was just kind of trying to have fun. But there was a regional in Philadelphia that year. I ended up in the top four playing like a weird gimmicky deck, but I lost to Pramelot in top four, and he was playing Guardy Gallade. And I was like, oh, damn, this is really good again. I should, going into nationals, like I should test this. And so I took Pramelot's list from the regionals. I tweaked some stuff, and then I played it at nationals. And like you said, I got top 16. I ended up losing to Puka, actually, funnily enough,
Mm.
in top 16 of that nationals. Um, and I think if I had made top eight, I would have gotten my Worlds invite, which was like not even a thing in the back of my mind because, like I said, I wasn't really playing seriously that year. But I think if I had gotten top eight, I would have gotten the invite. But then Premwat did not play Guardy Gallade at nationals, but he saw me top 16 with Guardy, and then he took my list of Guardy and tweaked it, and then he played it at the World Championships that year, and then he got second. So it was kind of funny that we like bounced back and forth off each other from tournament to tournament, tweaking Guardy throughout that season, which was cool.
Yeah, you just kind of kept like inadvertently inspiring each other. That's pretty
Hmm.
that's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Um so just looking at a couple of your other finishes, these have been a lot of more of like the what people call like retro formats now, which I don't know if that just makes you feel
Yeah.
old when people call that retro, or when, like 2017 is retro and things like that, right?
Hmm.
Um, one of your other like big finishes that are just like, and I'm sure like just because of record keeping like
Hmm.
you said, like states and gym challenges, things like that. It's a little harder to find
Yeah, yeah,
the results of those. But in the more like what people call like the modern era of the game, in the
hmm
2016-17 season, you got second place at Philadelphia Regionals
hmm
with Excelgor Wobbuffet.
Yep.
Could you tell us a little bit about that tournament and that run? Um, and I do also want to ask, is this like because it was an expanded regional, is this the season
Yeah.
that like you would play standard day one, expanded day two, or was this like fully an expanded regional?
This one was fully expanded.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so let me give you like before I talk about this, I'll give you like a brief timeline of all the years that I played. So like I said, I kind of really started playing competitively 2004. I played pretty competitively from 2004 through the 2008 Worlds and or 2000 yeah, 2008 Worlds. Then my senior year of high school, I played a little bit, but not that much. And then I went to college and I played like a little bit, but not anything seriously. And then when I graduated college in 2014, that's when I kind of came back and wanted to play more seriously again. So 2014 Worlds I went to but didn't play, and then the first regional right back from Worlds 2014 was also Philadelphia Regionals, and I got top eight at that, which was cool. And that was the year where they started doing the standard day one, expanded day two.
Mm.
Um, and then so I got my world invite for 2014, 2015 season, and then the 2015, 2016 season. And then I think this tournament, the Philadelphia 2016, was like an early event in the 2016, 2017 season. Um, so yeah, so at that point it was fully expanded regional. Excelgor Wobbuffet was a deck that Ross Cawthon had played a bunch. Ross and I are very good friends. Um, Hold on one sec.
You're good.
Just muting some Discord notifications. Yeah, Ross and I have been testing buddies for a super long time. And so this was a deck that he had put a lot of work in to. And going into this expanded regional, I think I was between Excelgor Wobbuffet and I think I really liked Groudon for this event too, but I don't think I could pull together the tropical beaches in enough time. So I stuck with the Excelgor. Uh, and it was just such a fun deck to play because it's a deck that requires a lot of math because you want to try to. So for those of the listeners that don't know what a Selgor does, for two colorless energy, did 50 damage and paralyzed and poisoned your opponent, but then Excelgor would shuffle itself back into the deck. So you would often try to set up these loops where your opponent would be knocked out from the poison coming back into your turn. So then you could just paralyze the next thing and then, set up these basically checkmate scenarios. There wasn't a ton of switching cards that were being played in the format at the time. And Guzma had not been released yet. So there wasn't a whole lot of like switch and escape rope. The primary way to actually switch your Pokemon was the Keldeo EX, which had an ability that, once during your turn, you could move Keldeo from the bench to the active. And then Floatstone was a tool that was very popular, and that's part of the reason why switch cards were not played, because Floatstone was so powerful. It's a tool that gave the Pokemon free retreat. And Wobbuffet is a Pokemon that, if it's active, your opponent's Pokemon don't have any abilities. So you would Excelgor, you would paralyze poison them, and then you'd pop back into the Wobbuffet, and so it would shut off the Keldeo. So if they didn't play any actual switch cards, then they were just stuck for that turn. So it was this really cool lock deck that took pretty good matchups across the board. It was just pretty difficult to play, and the games were pretty long. Even though it was best of three, a lot of my rounds we only finished one game because the first game might take 35 minutes, and then game two just wouldn't finish. And yeah, it was a really cool tournament. I ended up playing Sam Chen, again, one of my very longtime friends, in top four. We had a really, really close set, but I won. And then I ended up losing in the finals to John Crespo playing Trevenant. Trevenant was like the one deck, the one matchup that was really bad for the deck.
Because it just
Um,
item locked, right?
yeah, they item locked me, and like so, you would Excel Gore them, you would paralyze them, but then it's just really hard to set up the next Excel Gore because you played all these items like level ball and blah blah blah, and you'd be like trying to churn through your deck, but it's so much harder to churn through your deck when you don't have access to your items. Um, and so they would item lock and they could spread. So like then you needed in the Shelmets, the basic for Excelgor only had 60 HP. So if you didn't get to evolve to Excelgor, then they would just die in 2 turns. And yeah, it was a tough matchup. I think I won one of the games, but yeah, couldn't win 2 out of 3.
Hmm. Speaking of kind of spiritual reprints of cards, we do now have the Dunsparce that
Yeah.
that has a very similar attack. So that's also just a funny little thing I realized. Yeah, but this deck seems very interesting and also very frustrating to deal with. I can only imagine what it felt like to be your opponent getting item locked because a very like another Excelgor focused deck also had won U.S. Nationals a few years before, hadn't it?
Yeah, the Gothitelle Excelgor.
Hmm.
Yeah, similar. So like you had Excelgor, and then Gothitelle, when it was active, your opponent couldn't play item cards. So that deck was a little bit less of a looping deck and just kind of like annoying, where you would paralyze them and item lock them, and then just eventually get there.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of a different take on the lock them forever strategy.
Hmm.
Um, Now, do you I've already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but in general, just kind of through all your experience with the game, playing so many different formats, playing at different points in the game, seeing how it's changed, um, do you have any kind of go-to advice for newer players who are looking to improve at the game? If there's kind of any suggestions you'd give to a player, or maybe currently give to players who are looking to get better, what is kind of the typical like Mike Fouchet advice on how to get better at the Pokemon TCG?
I think things definitely have changed over time. Um, but Pokemon. So like advice certainly changes over time as well because the game uh, is played differently, both in terms of the actual game, but also like the tournament structure, and then even just like the season uh, is almost something you have to play like as well.
Yeah, like you're not
But
going to your one regional of the season anymore. You're going to
yeah, yeah, yeah.
15 of them or whatever.
Yeah. So, but there are still some like, evergreen advice things. So, I wrote these 2 articles for Six Prizes when Six Prizes first came out. Do you know what Six Prizes is?
Yes, so I started playing in black and white, so I'm familiar with a
Okay.
lot of those like early 2010s like sites and resources, which most of which don't really exist anymore, other than like Poke Beach, right?
Yeah, right, right. So yeah, when Six Prizes first came out, it was like 2010. I was one of the few like founding writers. So I remember I wrote these couple articles that I still refer back to sometimes. So I kind of just pulled them up right now when you asked that question, just to see what I wrote. And I think a lot of these things still hold water. So one of them is like pretty obvious. Archetypes are your friends. Like and we kind of already talked about it, right? The good decks are good for a reason.
Hmm.
So if you're trying to really be competitive, like that's where you should start. Like don't try to reinvent the wheel. Learn how to play the good decks well, and I think you're gonna have a better time. Another like good piece of advice that I really like is, um, you might have an idea of how you want to play a certain matchup or a certain deck in a certain way, but you really have to, in each individual game, evaluate and play to that situation. Um, Obviously, in Pokemon, you want to mitigate risk as much as possible, but you also have to recognize, am I playing to win the game or am I making plays to not lose the game? And
Mm.
you don't really want to make plays to not lose the game. You want to make plays to win the game. Um, so like an example is there was this Gengar back in the day, I think around 2010, that had an ability that if you knocked it out, then the Gengar player would get to flip a coin. If heads, it would knock out the attacking Pokemon as well. And there were ways to get around this ability. There was in Uxie, the Uxie that was popular in that day would do 20 damage and then shuffle itself back into the deck. So if you knock the Gengar out with Uxie, then the Gengar ability would never activate because the Uxie was gone. So when you were playing against Gengar, you would try to do that. You'd like hit the Gengar for some amount of damage and then Uxie to finish the KO. And that was the primary strategy. But if you got really far behind against the Gengar deck, the correct play was just to swing into the Gengar, knock it out, and just hope they flip tails, right? Because if you try to get too fancy, you're just going to keep falling more and more and more behind in the prize exchange, and you're never actually going to win the game. Like you might be making the technically correct play for most games, but you're going to lose that particular game because you're too far behind. And I think that's a pretty good idea to take in general, is that like you got to make plays that are going to give you a chance to actually win the game. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like just kind of evaluating risk, right? Like you
Yeah.
said, like the technically smart play that if you don't want to get knocked out is that you two-shot the Gengar. Well, if you're down four prizes to six, if you're two-shotting this Gengar, you're never going to be up in prizes. You just have to take that risk eventually. Um,
hmm
so yeah, I get that. Just kind of like evaluating at what point kind of like triaging, right? Kind of like being like, oh well, like my primary strategy at this point is no longer viable. What are my other, options to win? What can I do to maximize my odds of winning at this point?
Yeah, exactly. And then I guess just the last one that I'll say for now is know your know your deck list. Like you should be able to, if you're going to play in like anything like a regional size or bigger, like you should be able to just write down your 60 cards as soon as someone asks you. Like you should know every card in your deck. Whether you do prize checking or not, that's kind of up to you. But you got to know your 60 cards, like kind of by heart. And then on the flip side of that is you should know generally what the card, like what your opponent's deck list looks like as soon as the game starts. Like if your opponent flips over an Arceus and Nest Balls for a Bidoof, you should be thinking, okay, this is Arceus Giratina. They run probably, well, in this format, they probably run 3 or 4 Judge, 3 or 4 Iono, they run 4 Path, they're running 3 Boss, maybe 4 Boss, blah, 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 etc. So you should have like a general picture of what your opponent's deck is. And I think this point was probably much more important 10 years ago when lists were not quite as easy to come by. Now it's so easy to like before a tournament go on Limitless or Play Limitless and be like, okay, here are the top 10 decks. Let's just look through some lists, get a really good idea, and kind of have that in the back of your mind as you start a tournament because that information is so valuable. And it also gives you a reason as a player to take maybe like a stock list and make a tweak or two so that your opponents might be caught off guard a little bit. So, like the Reagan Lugia list that did super well. I mean, that list was amazing. You could just play that list straight up and be fine. But there was also some value in taking that list and making like a slight change. Maybe you drop like the third Urn of Vitality for an impact energy. And maybe as your opponent is playing against you, they realize, you're playing the single strike Lugia deck, and in their head, they make some calculation where, they think you can't do something and then you can. So, no, don't just make a change just for the sake of it. But I do think that aspect of deck building is interesting to consider going into tournaments these days when lists have become much more homogenized. Is that the right word?
I
I
think
think so.
so. I hope so. That makes a lot of sense, and Yeah, that's also good. Another good point. Like that's a similar thing to like when I talked to Alessandro Camascoli a couple weeks ago, he was also saying Reagan's list is like a seems to be like a consistent example in these things. He was saying, the deck is good, right? Like clearly the deck is good. Why change something just for the sake of changing it, right? Like if the deck is good, play the good deck. And you're saying kind of a similar thing. Like don't just change it for the sake of changing it, but if you are changing it, like you know, be intentional about it, right? Don't do it just to not have Reagan's 60 cards and change
Right.
something for the sake of doing it. There still needs to be reason behind why you do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, I think, now that we're talking about, homogenized, talking about like the meta a little bit, things like that, I think I do want to ask a little bit about NAIC, which is coming up. Like you said at the beginning, this will be releasing after NAIC. So we I know you are on the cusp of your Worlds invite. You were able to get an NAIC, sign up for it with like that last wave of like 20 slots or however many it was. Um, what is kind of your, without revealing any secrets if you don't want to, what is your plan for NAIC looking like now that do you just need any amount of points essentially from the event to get your invite?
Yeah, any points. So top
Gotcha.
5-12 will get me
Okay.
there. Yeah.
So going like 6-3, what is your strategy?
I mean, I'm trying not to look at it too differently than if I wanted to, day two or win the event. It does disincentivize me to play something like really risky. So like something like Chi and Pao, I think is extremely underexplored in this format. People have been trying different things, and I just feel like nobody has really found the right combination of 60 cards to make the deck, you know, as good as it could be. And I would love to be able to crack that code, but it just seems a little too risky for me in the spot that I'm in. So I'll probably end up playing something pretty meta, pretty straightforward. The two decks that I'm considering the most are Gardevoir and Lugia. They're the decks that I've played the most in the previous format. Um, and they don't change drastically going into this format. Obviously, Gardevoir gets a bunch of upgrades, um, but they're both just they're pretty consistent. They have a very high power level. They have a chance in every single matchup, which is really I think what I need to make sure that I get my 5-3-1 or whatever I
Mm-hmm.
need. Um, the biggest thing that I'm thinking about when deciding, at least between those two decks, is how long the games take. Gardevoir games take quite a while, and Lugia games don't. So Lugia is maybe slightly edging out Gardevoir right now, but we'll see how the next few days go, just because I feel more confident that I can finish a full best of three in 50 minutes. But I do think Gardevoir is a stronger deck. I am more comfortable playing Gardevoir. But I think the time restraints just might be a little bit too much for it. And we did hear from a bunch of people that went to Puerto Rico this past weekend that with Gardevoir and Lost Box being, the two most powerful, the two most popular decks, there was a lot of ties. I think I
Yes.
saw someone posted that at the end of round three, there was only three 3-0s out of like 125 people, which is crazy. Um, so that is definitely a big worry and something that I think everyone should really be thinking about. Even if they're not playing one of those decks, they're going to be playing against those decks, and you gotta play fast. You gotta know when to scoop, um, because you want to try and finish 3 games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of relevant to a question I was thinking of in terms of Guardy being so popular. I mean, people saying that it's going to be. I mean, I've heard all sorts of range. People say it's 20% of the meta, 35% of the meta, which seems a little ambitious, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
How much when you go into an event that sometimes has like a very clear best deck, which Guardy seems to be the best deck, even if it's not like some sort of tier 0 deck where nothing like by no means can like nothing else beat it, right?
Yeah.
But if you're kind of looking at the decks you want to play and you're looking at, maybe I want to play Guardy, how much stock are you putting into the fact that you're going to be playing a lot of mirrors? Are you just thinking, well, I'll get good at Guardy and I'll play them because it is a mirror that actually like requires some skill? Obviously, if the meta was like 30% Mew decks, I would not want to play Mew. That mirror is not quite as skill
Yeah.
intensive. Um, how much stock do you put into trying to avoid playing mirrors? Because I feel like I've seen a lot of people say, well, the last thing I want to do is play Guardy because I don't want to just be playing mirrors every other round. But then I feel like you can also make the case of why not just get really, really good at the mirror and beat the mirror every single round?
Yeah, I feel like both are reasonable approaches, like you said, especially for like Guardian Mirror or Lost Box Mirror. I was reading I was reading Grant's Lost Box article from like a month ago, and he was talking about the Lost Box Mirror. He's like, you could play cards like Halucha or Roxanne, or you could just have brain cells. And I feel like that's, a similar sentiment. Um, yeah, so for me, like in this instance, so thinking about Gardevoir Mirror and the popularity of Gardevoir, I guess I would, if I didn't play Gardevoir, I would want to ensure whatever deck I was playing had at least a 50-50 versus Gardevoir. Because
Mm-hmm.
in theory, right, the mirror is 50-50. You might be able to, gain some edges by playing it a bunch and being good, but still in theory it's 50-50. And so if the other deck that I would want to play is not 50-50, then I should probably just play Gardevoir and take the 50-50 in mirrors. But as long as like Lugia, I need to play the matchup a bit actually the next couple of days. And if I feel like the Lugia versus Gardevoir matchup is 50-50-ish, then I'm much more comfortable bringing Lugia to the event. So I feel like I think about it more in contrast to what are my other alternatives and are the matchups like versus that deck and the mirror, like are they better, worse, or are they about the same? And then that kind of really helps me evaluate. I don't know if that kind of
Yeah,
made sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, I mean, I think we saw a similar thing with like the Lugia format before rotation. People were saying like, you don't have to play Lugia, but you can't play a deck that's bad against Lugia, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you just want to take that risk, right? And sometimes people get lucky, like we saw at what I think at Fresno there was like the Darkrai player where last like 5 rounds of day two he just kept playing Mew and beating them. And sometimes that happens, right? Like it's possible that you just won't hit the deck that beats you and you have a good run. That's always completely possible.
Hmm.
Especially at a tournament that has 2,000 2,000 players. Um, do you have kind of any predictions for NAIC in terms of things that you're expecting, things that might surprise people? What do you think the event is going to look like if you were to give your guess that will be released after the the event?
Um, it's so hard when you have such a massive event like this. It's really hard to make any meaningful predictions, I feel like. Um, it also matters so much what the best players end up choosing because I could say that, I don't think Arceus decks are going to do that well. And I don't think Arceus decks are like a super great play for this event. But if, the top, if 80 of the top 100 people in the players in the world decide to bring Arceus decks are going to do really well. Um, and so I feel like that component is really tough. So, but I do think so. I would predict that the majority of top players bring some type of Lost Zone deck, and therefore Lost Zone will do very well.
Mm.
We saw in Puerto Rico, I think like 5 of the top 8 were Lost Zone decks, and so I would bet 2 to 3 Lost Zone decks are in top 8, but they make up like a solid like 30% of the top 32 maybe.
Hmm.
Um, so that would like be a pretty big prediction. I think Guardy is gonna have like kind of a tough time, to be honest. At least in terms of uh, converting based on its big numbers. Like So I know you were saying like there's pretty wide ranges of what people predict. Let's just say that there's like 25% Gardevoir. I would bet that that percentage goes down on day two, like
Hmm.
maybe like 25 to like 20% on day two, just because it's going to tie a lot. There's going to be a lot of players that really like to play Gardevoir that maybe are not as experienced with the deck. It's a little bit, how do I put this? It's almost as hard as Lost Box. It's not as hard as Lost Box, but it's almost as hard as Lost Box. And I don't think it's perceived as being quite as difficult. So I think there's going to be plenty of players that are a little bit less experienced that decide that they want to play Gardevoir, and they're gonna have a tough time a playing well and b finishing enough games. So I think Guardy will not have the best conversion rate. I think Lost will be whatever its percentage is day one will probably be about the same percentage day two. I think Lugia always like overperforms a little bit, going from day one to day two, but I feel like it's going to be tough for it to make too many day two spots. Mew, Mew, I don't know. I really don't like Mew. I feel like Mew is really, really bad into Lost Box. And then if, you know, decks like Gardevoir and Arceus play Spirit Tomb, like you don't have super great matchups there then either. So I don't love Mew. I don't love Arceus. I feel like Chi and Pao, if like a group cracks Chi and Pao, I could see it winning the event. But otherwise, probably not going to do that well either. So I don't know. That's just kind of a bunch of random thoughts thrown out there.
All right. Well, we'll have to reference back to it, I'm sure afterwards. Um, but yeah, I think it's a very good point with Guardy. Like, if we when you watch someone play Lost Box on stream, like you can see even like the top players just having like, you know, mentally struggling with like some of like the most minute decisions. And then Guardy on paper is just like, oh, I just refinement and then put like 10 energy on a dude, right? It if you're not kind of looking deeper into how the game is being played and the decisions that are being made, it looks easier. Just because you have less like, things like lost zoning stuff is not going on in that deck, but it is a deceptively complicated deck, I would say.
Hmm. Yeah, I very much agreed.
Yeah. And it is funny that you were saying at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about Guardy Gallade, and you were saying, "Oh, this Gardevoir was so good with Scramble Energy." And I'm like, "Oh, that sounds very, very similar."
Yeah.
We're what year is it, right? Um,
Hmm.
Now, before we start wrapping up, I do also just want to ask you a little bit about the Trashalanche podcast. Could you just tell
Sure.
us about what is the Trashalanche podcast? How did that the group of is it Brett Halberton and Britt Pybus? Is that right?
Hmm.
Yeah. How
Yep.
did that group of you three kind of get together and decide to start producing a podcast?
Yeah, so I mentioned six prizes earlier. I wrote for six prizes for a long time, and then I didn't play for a little bit, so kind of waned a bit. But then when I came back in like the 2014, 2015 year, I wrote a little bit more, but I wasn't super into writing articles as much when I came back. But at some point I wanted to do a podcast. And so I did the Six Prizes podcast for about a year myself. And it was just me as the host, and I would pull together like two or three players, and we would have a discussion going into, regionals and whatnot. And that was pretty fun. I liked it, but it was a lot of work just doing it myself and trying to get multiple people's schedules like all synced up. Like at least when you're doing this yourself, but you're just doing a one-on-one each time. Um, but trying to get like two or three people all at once was tough. But I really enjoyed it still. And so, I did it for a year, and then we didn't do it for a couple years. And then over COVID, Brent Brent had also written some articles for Six Prizes from a dad's perspective, and Britt also wrote for Six Prizes. So we weren't like super good friends or anything, but we were friendly with each other and familiar with each other. And Brent posted, I don't remember if it was on Twitter, or probably on Twitter. He's like, "Hey, like I kind of think I'd like to do a podcast. Anybody interested?" And both Britt and I just messaged him and was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And so that's kind of just how it started. Brent expressing the interest, and so we got started in like September of 2020, I guess. So about, you know 4 or 5 months into lockdown or into COVID. There wasn't really a super big online scene just yet because Play Limitless didn't come out for a few months after that. But we started chatting and doing it once a week, and yeah, and now we're going on almost 3 years, and it's pretty fun. It's a nice way to verbalize all of the various thoughts that we've had about Pokemon throughout the previous week. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but just the ability to talk about this Pokemon stuff out loud. I don't get to do that all the time in a given week. And so like I learn stuff just by like talking through it on air, which is cool.
Yeah, there's only so much time we can spend just like reading Twitter stuff, and it's also not good for us. So it's nice to just sometimes congregate and like share that information with each other instead of like trying to get glued to your screen and taking all the drama and all the updates yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is kind of do you have any kind of like long-term goals for where you want the podcast to be, or are you just kind of happy with where it is, approaching its third year, things running smoothly?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I feel like we are not super ambitious with what we're trying to do. Like I think we enjoy the level of commitment that we put into it. We don't honestly during the first like year we would do a lot more planning for the episodes. We have this Google Doc that we would write the points of discussion on, blah blah blah, and we still have that Google Doc, and we do like periodically put stuff on there, but it's so much more free flowing now that and we've been doing it for longer, so we just kind of have the natural rhythm more ingrained in us. And you're a teacher, so I'm sure you can appreciate the first couple of years of teaching. It's really actually helpful to write lesson plans and whatnot, and have those plans that you can refer to and show people and talk about them. But at some point, it becomes much less needed because you just have the experience to do it. You can just kind of like go up and teach. And I feel like it's kind of been the same thing with the podcast. So I feel like we're at a level where we enjoy what we're doing. We don't really need it to be bigger or anything. And so no real long-term plans, just kind of like keep doing what we're doing. We have kind of added like a fourth host, kind of. Caden Hyatt has been on the podcast quite a lot over the last like 2 months. And so he's kind of like our unofficial fourth member right now. And that gives us a little bit of flexibility where if one of us three can't be there in a certain week, we still have like 3 people to bounce ideas. Because I feel like the way that our podcast is structured, it's really nice to not just have 2 people having a conversation. And so having 3 consistently is pretty good.
Mike, as we start to wrap up, I know you're going to be at NAIC. You said I know you told me this stuff. I don't know if it actually got mentioned when we started recording. You said no matter what the finish at NAIC is, you will be at Worlds.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about that and just kind of what events you're planning on being at this summer as we start to wrap up?
Yeah. So honestly, before locals got announced, I had no chance, or I had no chance of getting an invite, and I was totally okay with that. But I still wanted to go to Worlds if possible. My wife and I have talked a bit about, just going to Japan in general. So this was like a super great excuse to go. And so I'm flying in, I think I get there like the Wednesday before Worlds, and I'm staying with Ross for those couple days through Worlds. And then my wife flies in the Sunday of Worlds, and then we're doing like 10 or 11 days traveling around Japan. So that's going to be a super awesome trip. I know a lot of people are doing similar types of extended stays in Japan. So super excited for that. Next season is a little bit of a question mark for me. We'll have to see like what the details are of the circuit, if it's very similar to this year, or if they're going to change some things up. I actually took over a league here in Philadelphia. So I'm the league leader. I ran a league challenge for the first time. I ran a league cup for the first time yesterday.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
yeah, and it was really fun. And so I am kind of at a little bit of a crossroads of like, do I want to keep playing competitively, or do I want to continue to foray into this more organizer judge type of role?
Mm,
Um, and I'm just not sure yet.
yeah.
I think this next season might be a bit of a hybrid, and we'll kind of like see how the first half of the season goes for me. And then if it goes well, then I can play more competitively. And if it doesn't go super well, then maybe not play competitively during the second half, and then do more organizer stuff. And then another aspect of this is that my wife and I are hoping to have a kid in the next year or two, so that would obviously affect
Yes, for
that
sure.
type of stuff as well. So it's a little bit uncertain over the next year or two, but you know, I will 100% be at any regional that I can drive to. So like this past year, there was Baltimore and Hartford that were both quite close to me. So you know, if they are in similar locations, I'll definitely be there. And then everything else is a little bit of a question mark.
Mm, okay, well, I mean that's kind of a cool note to end on, though. Just kind of excited for the future. A lot of different, a lot of different possibilities, right?
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
do you have any shout outs before we get wrapped up?
Um, sure. I'll shout out some of my very close friends. Like I said, I'm good friends with Ross, good friends with Pablo, stayed with Pablo at a UIC, staying with Ross at NAIC. Um, those are probably like the two people that I talk with the most about Pokemon. But I also have like I have a group chat with like 10 other people that I started this year that has been really successful. Includes people like Kieran Farah, Jeremy Gibson, etc. So shout out to all those guys in that group. And then the Philadelphia local scene has been super welcoming and super supportive. I had lived in Philadelphia for a few years, 3 years, a few years ago, but then we moved back to Philadelphia last summer. And the local scene here has been awesome. They you know, as I was trying to get the last couple points for my Worlds invite, they were like really cheering me on and really supportive as I've become an organizer. They've showed up for league, they've showed up for my tournaments. Everyone is the scene is both like booming in terms of popularity, and they just like it's a bunch of really good people. So
Same.
it's been a really awesome experience this year getting involved in the Philly scene. So shout out to all them.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I'm sure they'll love the shout out as well. And I'll put like the link to Trashalanche and your six prizes articles in the show notes as well if anyone wants to check out all of your great stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Please go listen.
Yes, we'll do. So Mike, thank you again for joining us. I really appreciated it. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to Mike for being so generous with his time. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one, please consider giving the podcast a follow, review, or rating wherever you're listening. Or if you want to follow us on social media, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at memcappodcast. Or if you want to see me post about my own TCG experiences, you can follow me on Twitter at RZGladys. Hope you have a great day, and thank you for listening.